Maria was a postdoc here in the MVZ and then absconded across the bay to Stanford, where she's, I believe, continued partly some of the same work she was doing here. And so she's going to be talking about the historical ecology to assess environmental change in California, which of course is of great interest to a lot of us because it directly links with other aspects of the Grinnell project. Thank you.
Well, thank you again. It's great to be back. I'm usually soft-spoken, so I will try to yell, but if you don't hear me, just come up forward and we'll see how it goes. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. So today I'm going to basically talk about what is this idea of historical ecology, which should be very familiar to all of you, and give you some examples of my previous work here with the Grinnell Resurvey project and my current work now on reconstructing California conservation history. So historical ecology, it's not a new term. It's actually brought to the ecological literature since 1983, and there was actually a review ecological monograph that actually talked about the uses of historical ecology to answer some ecological questions. And so this is basically because it is now accepted that today's communities and ecosystems are the product of evolution, human disturbance, history, and present-day dynamic processes. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the human disturbance history part of this. So historical ecology focus on integrating data sets that span different spatial scales and different temporal scales. And so basically what you do, you try to compare and contrast what you find at different scales, both spatially and temporal. And here is a plot that kind of summarizes the type of data sets that historical ecology focus on. So you can have palynology, you can have remote sensing, meteorology, and climate records, and you can integrate those across time and space. So for example, since we're really focused sometimes on understanding shifts in species ranges, this is an example from palynology records that show that pinyon pine used to be a low elevation species, and now over time it has become more of a mid to high elevation species. So this is the type of research that historical ecology can inform. And of course, there are some advantages and disadvantages to using this type of data and methods to infer ecological processes. Some of the advantages, we can understand the dynamic nature of landscapes. We can provide a frame of reference if that is a necessary step. We can identify state shifts, analogs and non-analogs to previous conditions. We can understand ecological and cultural legacies, and we can use this type of data to calibrate and test some of the models that we're developing. Of course, there are some disadvantages. The historical record may be spotty or fragmentary, or it just does not cover the process that you're interested in. Or what is this selection of the appropriate reference conditions? Where do you start? Despite these are just some of the examples where the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology here has been key on using historical ecology to understand different types of ecological processes, and so these are some of the examples of papers that have been published using data stored in these cabinets here and comparing it and contrasting to current state data sets. So this brings us to 1924's paper from Joseph Grinnell, and this brings us to what I was doing here as a postdoc in the prior 2 years to this one. So in this paper, if you actually do a Wordle, if you copy his words from the paper into a Wordle, you see that Grinnell was onto something. The most commonly spoken word or written word was species. And you can see species related to evolution, to environmental conditions over time. And so this is kind of what brought me here. We had this magnificent project that looked into Grinnell records and resurveyed the same locations in many parts of the California ecosystems. I know this is outdated. I've seen the new website. It has a new polygon that goes kind of like here. And so what do these data sets cover? you have photographs of specimens, you have photographs of the researchers and how they set, and you have also written descriptions of what they did and where they did things. And so this is just an example of the Yosemite Transect. This is Yosemite National Park. This is the transect and where did these historical surveys occurred and where the modern resurveys occurred as well. So this led to a very prominent publication in 2008 by the previous director of the museum, Craig Moritz, that shows that despite there are different significant range changes in small mammal communities, there is this general trend that many species are moving upward, and that was associated with climate change over the last century. But we also know that climate change can operate either directly or indirectly through changes in vegetation, and that's kind of what brought me here, is that we know that environment has changed. And so the idea was to link these reports on small mammals changes with reports on vegetation change. And so how do we use these reports of mammals? So in case you're not familiar with the hand-drawn precious books that are in those shelves, this is a depiction of how they look like. So what the Grinnell Reservoir Project did was to actually get information from these books. You get information on the collector, the date and the location, and then you get information on specimens, trapline information, and geographic location. And you use that to compare with modern locations. In parallel to the Grinnell Reservoir Project, UC Berkeley and UC Davis have been developing this project that is the Wieslander vegetation type mapping. So in the 1930s, Albert Wieslander was responsible for surveying the state for the forest resources. And so basically he covered the entire state, but today we were able to recover about 1/3 of his maps. And so these maps and data that he collected include vegetation plots, include voucher specimens that are housed here at UC Berkeley. They include landscape photos, and they include the vegetation maps. And those are the vegetation maps that I've been using. In your right-hand side, you see the side of California, and the hand-drawn little squares are the maps that we were able to recover for today. So what have we been doing? So in case you're curious about what they did, so compared to Grinnell Resurveys, they actually cut the time-sensitive topographic maps, and they went to vantage points and they hand-drew and color-coded vegetation associations that they could see from those vantage points. So what we've been doing is to actually transform those, so georeference them, create a seamless map, and then use these vegetation associations and cross-reference them to current-day vegetation associations to look at change. So this is the historical land cover in the Yosemite Transect. This is the current land cover in Yosemite Transect at the same land cover classes. And so this allows us to assess, okay, what changed in Yosemite? And this is just for the Yosemite Transect itself, so that strip of land that I've showed you. So what you see, there are some land cover classes, and I'm sorry, these are all by California wildlife habitat relationships types. So they go from like blue oak woodland, montane chaparral, and so what you see is there, some of them decreased, mostly at the expense of an increase of a category that is called the Sierra mixed conifer, which includes several dominant species. What we also see that these changes are not constant across the elevation transect, and most of the change actually occurs somewhere in between 1900 and 1,000 to 2,000 meters in elevation. And so we wanted to also compare these changes in vegetation with changes in climate. So here you also have the elevation ranges at 100-meter bins. And so you can see that different climate variables also change differently across the elevation transect. This is minimum temperature, maximum temperature, precipitation, and climatic water deficit. So how much water is available for plants in the soil. So we tried to use this information on these changes of mammals, vegetation, and climate to actually understand if the changes in habitat predict the observed changes in mammals' ranges. So we thought about it as plotting it in a 4-quadrant graph. On one hand, on the y-axis, we know the change in species elevation ranges. So if you go from 0 above, species have gone up. If you go this way, species have gone down. And you do the same for the habitat elevation range. So I've talked about vegetation, but I haven't talked yet how I categorized habitat for species. So we use that vegetation type, and then we multiply the vegetation types with these habitat suitability indexes that are published by the California Fish and Wildlife Agency. And we use those as the best representation we had for each one of these vertebrates as their suitable habitat. And so we use those as the change, and we look into where the habitat elevation range went from historic times to today. So, and then we just put the species, the little stars, where they would fall. So basically the results are like this. So what we found is that we would expect that if species are tracking habitat changes, species will be either here or here. So what we see is that actually the pattern seems more at random, or there's different species doing different things. So what we see is that species that expanded the habitat, their range, their habitat also expanded. But what you see is that for most species actually their habitat expanded their range, but the species that contracted the range are going in the opposite direction as their habitat. So this suggests that there are a little bit of a partitioning between the species that expanded and the species that contracted. The ones that expanded seem to follow their habitat, the ones that contracted seem to be dictated by some other pressures. And then if we do this if we look into the lower and the upper limit of their distributions, we find a little bit similar patterns as before. Then we try to see, okay, can we use these depictions of vegetation and climate to predict these known changes in their range? So here we have, for Temius alpinus, we have their distribution. And so in here we have based on vegetation on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side we have based on climate. And so this is one of the few species that actually both vegetation and climate predicted the same direction as the range change. So when we did this for all the species that we have at hand, actually comparing the occupancy results from the science paper to the predicted directions from climate and vegetation, only for 4 species these actually matched. So these results were not as exciting as they could have been, but they just show that there's a quite wide variety of responses at the landscape scale that we may not be depicting. So we wanted to see also if this could have been a function of more population level processes looking into abundance profiles in elevation. And so we wanted to look into 2 characteristics of an abundance profile. So the idea is, because we have a transect, we can actually figure out how does the abundance look like. Ecological theory has been back and forth about this central abundant hypothesis, that you have in the distribution range at the center you have higher abundance, and as you move forward or as you move away from the center you have lower abundance. We wanted to look into these and see if these abundance profiles could in some way predict the direction in which species were moving. So we wanted to look into changes in peak abundance, so where is this peak located, but we also wanted to see whether the abundance profile was skewed or not skewed. So did it have a tail in a given direction that would predict where the range was going, or did it not have a tail and then we would predict it? So we calculated abundance as the maximum number of individuals divided by the trapping effort and divided by the detectability that was calculated using the occupancy models, and then we calculated the sample skewness. And so these are just some examples of abundance profiles. And these go in elevation, and here you have historic, sorry, the resolution is, so you have historic dots, and then you have in open circles the modern abundance representation. So those are the type of data that we're using to calculate these metrics. And so basically what we found is that in the y-axis here you have change in abundance. So here is 0, you have decrease or increase, and in the x-axis, sorry. And here you see the change in the elevation range. And so basically what we found is that for species that expanded their range, they were related to decrease in their abundance. And so species that contracted, we actually call them double doom, because not only the range was shrinking, there were more of them within that range itself. And then that range expansion was related with increase in skewness. So you had a longer tail in either in one direction than in previous historical times. So these are some of the lessons learned throughout this project. We found that different species have very different responses. For some of them we found that they tracked habitat changes, and for some of them we found that they did not. And unfortunately the abundance distribution profiles did not explain as well as we wanted these range expansions.
On the skewness, is that in the modern distribution or the historical distribution?
Is the change in skewness. So
oh, okay. Less changing in skewness.
yes. So this brings me to change from what happened in Yosemite using the data from here to my current research on understanding conservation history in California. So here now we're going to move to another geographical area and to a different type of use of historical ecology data to assess other kind of ecological, and in this case conservation biology questions. So basically conservation history is looking into the history of events in the land, but actually bringing it more of a quantitative approach to it, looking into the change in land cover type as a function of land acquisition to answer questions of conservation success. This idea of preserving natural resources in terms of land acquisition and land conservation is not really new. It actually was started off in the 19th century in the British Empire colonies, mostly in India, and this idea was brought to the United States. And Henri Thoreau, he called for the creation of these national preserves of virgin forest, and these would serve several types of purposes. If you're interested in the history of land acquisition, you've seen that throughout, since this call was put forward in the 19th century until mid of the 20th century, land acquisition was mostly ad hoc. Land was acquired because it was available, because someone had a special interest, because it was economically feasible. But some reviews of how well did we do with the acquisition actually called that this created a biased reserve system that did not meet the goals of preserving biodiversity. So it's in the 1970s that you start to have a call for a more systematic selection of areas to conserve, and where do you want to go for it. So if we think about land acquisition, we have two concepts in the ecological literature that need to be taken in consideration. The first one is representation. What do you want to acquire land for? What do you want to preserve? So you know you want to create a set of reserves that could represent a given percent of the area of a given vegetation type, if that's your conservation goal, of a population of a threatened species. Could be climate, could be ecosystem services. How do you go about decide where to place these areas? Representation, as defined in the literature, is basically a function of the value of that land in terms of your conservation goal, and also the priority in terms of how pressured is this land to stay the same or to change. And so, in order to calculate these more dynamic aspects as threat, you actually need to look into this concept of resilience. So how much change can a system withstand and still stay the same, or do you actually account to absorb these changes in your reserve selection? So these were the concepts that kind of led me to this new area of historical ecology research. The question is conservation successful in California? Yes, it's a very ambitious question, but let's start to depict this in several components. So basically what I'm trying to do now is to look into the when in time was land acquired, where in space throughout the state, what, I'm going to show you some results in terms of land cover types, was acquired and when, and why and how did this land acquisition took place. So I'm going to focus today on the Bay Area because this has been one pilot study area, and as you all are very familiar, the urban growth in the land in the Bay Area, has depicted here from NASA Ames models, has been extensive. We're now about 30% of the land in the Bay Area is urban, or in some category of urban. So we have about 60 to 70% of land to do something in terms of conservation, but also maintaining agricultural and other uses. As we know, climate has also changed. So when we're trying to define where to put land for conservation, this also needs to be taken into consideration. So in order to understand the where, I'm using this data set that was created by Green Info Network. It's basically a GIS database that they converged several GIS databases from several management agencies on all, or as much as possible, open space properties throughout the state. They have created a small subset for the Bay Area, the Bay Area Protected Areas database. And so I'm using that Bay Area Protected Areas database, and I basically contacted every single agency that owns or manages each property to ask them for establishment or acquisition dates. As you can imagine, the process has been quite time consuming, and there's about 4,000 properties in the Bay Area, and responses go from people sending me books on information to people saying our staff got cut, so we can't give you this information, you can come visit our records. San Francisco is fantastic, they only keep their records for 20 years, so we don't really have more information than the last 20 years. But so far, I'm almost calling it done. We have about 90% of the properties dated, so this is pretty good. And this is the depiction. So the yellow are the earliest ones, and the red are the latest ones to be acquired.
So you don't have any of the national parks?
And I will explain why I only have this selection, because this has to do with historical map coverage. So this brings us to the historical map. So I showed you the where and when, and now what were these areas protected for? Of course, there are different goals, but we're now going to look into land cover change, and so this follows up my previous research here at the MVZ. We're again using the Vislander maps and comparing them to today. So in case you're not familiar to where you are, this was the landscape in the 1930s, and here you can see details of their map of what they actually hand drew and color coded. And so these maps have been georeferenced and put into a GIS polygon format and annotated with all the information that came with it. And so I'm comparing these maps with the regional effort put forward by the Bay Area Open Space Council on mapping the land cover types in this area. And so they were crosswalk to the same categories of California wildlife habitat relationships. And so this is the change from 1930s, 1940s in the Bay Area to today. So you'll see a big increase in this gray area, which are urban areas, mostly at the expense of these bright green areas, which were agriculture in 1940s. So if you like graphs rather than maps, here's your change. So you have here agricultural decrease and the increase in urban extent. So then, if we get to the question of representation, so this is the total percentage of the Bay Area land, and what is in the x-axis are the decades at which each open space properties were acquired, and the different colors represent different land cover types that were acquired according to the historical map. And so you can see that we're now about 25%. And this is not for the entire Bay Area, I should resolve. This is just for the extent of the historic map that we have for the Bay Area. And so we're now, so the full Bay Area is about 30% in open space, but for the area that we're doing the analysis with about 9,000 square kilometers. And this corresponds to 20 to 23% of area put into some sort of protection. And so what you'll see is, if you decompose these in terms of land cover, you see this bright green, which is grassland. And so that's the most represented land cover type in the current day open space map. So here's again the representation, and here you see per decade which land cover types were acquired at that decade. So you can see a prominent acquisition of grassland type, land cover types, also some agriculture, and then the oaks themselves also have a very high representation. Sorry, the previous one was cumulative, this one is the per decade, but the story is about the same. So if we talk about resilience, this graph here shows in green is the change in areas that were already in open space, and in beige is the change in areas that were not open space. So here what we're trying to see is open space doing better in terms of this change that we're observing at the landscape scale, or not. And so basically what we see is for most categories, open space and outside open space are changing in terms of increasing the area of that category, which is good, at the expense of some of the land cover types such as agriculture and barren land. If we now start to look into some details of these different land cover types, and I promise I will not bore you with all single land cover types. So let's talk a little bit about working landscapes. You've seen grassland, I put it here because it was the most conserved. We have some issues with the distinction in the historical time between agricultural and grassland, so that's why I'm plotting these two together. But those are, even if they are the same category, or even if they are different, they follow the same trend. Usually in conservation biology, you say you want to preserve 10 to 20% of a given land cover type, and that would be sufficient. This line represents the 20%. So for agriculture, we're a little bit below the 20%. For grassland, we're way above it. And so this is kind of the timeline of acquisition of each one of these land cover types. Then, what we tried to do is to look into this question of resilience. So I've showed you the maps that were based on the historical land cover type, but we also have what they are today. Some of these land covers actually changed, and some of them did not. So here, this graph basically has paired colors. So you'll see from the bottom to the top they are ordered. So agricultural did not change, agriculture that changed, etc., etc. So you'll see here that most of the land covers actually changed from what they were in the 1940s, even when they are already in open space styles. And you may be questioning, okay, where did it change? Did it change in a direction that we think it's good, or is it changing in a direction that is not as good? And so you can see, and that's why I was pointing out between agriculture and grasslands, a lot of agriculture is now classified as grasslands. So maybe this change is a little bit limited by the information we have from the historical sources, or maybe it is limited by the information we have from the modern sources, which are based on remote sensing classifications of grasslands and agriculture, which are very hard to separate. The grasslands actually showed, basically, they stayed the same. So grasslands were quite comfortable about it. The agricultural change is what we're not so comfortable about. So if we look into other types of categories, David Ackerley here predicted that the Bay Area is going to be chaparral in the future. So let's look a little bit into the chaparral conservation as of today. So again, you have the 20% representation goal. You have basically chaparral is doing pretty well, and coastal chaparral, given the availability of the land cover type in the landscape, is also doing pretty well with what we have already protected today. Oak woodlands, again the same. They are basically at 20 or more representation. And so this just shows you that the progression of acquisition through time. In terms of change, chaparral and oaks, they seem to be changing within themselves rather than changing to other land cover types. As you can see here, if you can pinpoint the different colors from the back. So, to get to the why and how, we're actually looking into the historical accounts from the first explorers to figure out what was there before. And then we're looking into land use policy reports to try to figure out what kind of policies and structure allowed for this acquisition. So just very much in summary, this is for the Bay Area itself. You'll see two graphs. The bottom graph is the number or the area that was put into open space at that one decade. And the gray line is the cumulative until that decade. And here are some events that can be linked with land acquisition or explain land acquisition at that decade. So you have some events at the national level. So there is an interest in acquiring land. As I said, in 1864, land reservation was called for, and you have the first national park to be created in 1870s. In California, so these orange arrows are California-only events. So you have a first control on logging of redwoods appearing in the turn of the century, and that seems to trigger a lot of conservation action itself. And then you have the creation or the surveys of the state parks. You have the creation of special districts, which are agencies that are mandated to acquire land in open space themselves. And you have creation of county parks and conservation easements. So all of this timeline of conservation policies led to the timeline of conservation action that we see on the ground. And of course, then you can plot the area that is acquired by decade by the agency that owns it itself. And then you can try to match this timeline with the timeline to see if there is a gap between when these policies are put in place and when do they actually start having conservation action on the ground. And here the horrific graph. So this basically tries to look into, so we've seen that there are different ownerships. Is a mandate by different agencies leading them to acquire land that is a different land cover type than the other ones. So these graphs here show federal land, state land, county land, city, special districts, and non-profits. And so this basically shows the different type of land cover types that each one of these agencies is trying to focus their conservation action on. And so, yes, we're almost done. Some lessons learned. As you can imagine, the use of this type of data sets is very overwhelming in trying to explain them and convey it in a relatively short time period, and especially outlook. But you can see that there is some trends, especially for the Bay Area. You have a conversion from the 18th to the 19th centuries of natural landscapes to agricultures, and during the 20th century from agriculture to urban. About 30% of the Bay Area is designated as open space. That's pretty good and very unique in the world, I would say. 30% is also urban, and some more is predicted to encompass the continuous urban growth. As I've showed you, open space follows multiple ownerships, and this follows the trajectory of when these agencies are put into place and their mandates change towards the conservation of landscape. And 25% or more of representation of each land cover type is already in the current open space representation. So that's pretty good. I've been doing some comparisons with Los Angeles, San Diego, and the Central Sierras, and that's the California wide, but that will be, I can show you some slides of what they are looking like, but the data acquisition for these other areas is being very hindered. So that you have an idea, the Bay Area landscape is about 4,000 open spaces. California-wide open spaces are 54,000. We have been able to date so far 12,000 of those, which is about 60% of the state, but we still have a lot of work to do before I can show you confidently the results for the statewide analysis. And so a lot of people to thank, Jim Thorne at UC Davis, and this is for just the last part, not the MVZ office. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
I want to ask you about your baseline, because even in both the Bay Area and in Yosemite, there were thousands of people who have been living there for thousands of years who were managing their landscapes, mostly with fire. And so changes that have occurred over the last 100 years in habitats have got to be much more important than the sort of fire suppression that happened after those people were displaced than, say, temperature or precipitation changes. And also, that's relevant in your comparisons of comparing from 1930s to the present in terms of open space in the Bay Area, given that this is a really high population density place. So just could you comment on the use of baseline? And
no, I agree with your comment. So one of the caveats of doing this type of analysis is the available historical data that you have. So you can either have modeled data for historical times where you can account for that. But here I'm using data that is not modeled, so it was recorded by explorers or by surveyors at the time. And so in order to change this baseline, you have to incorporate both types. So if you want to switch your baseline earlier in time, then you have to start using model data because we don't have historical records that go that far in time.
but you could probably incorporate, if you knew something about fire tolerance of the species involved, you might be able to incorporate that into your data.
That is totally
and the thing with grasslands too, it worries me because grasslands, there used to be native grasslands that were managed by fire. And now grasslands are mostly invasive annual species. And so those are really actually two completely different sorts of ecosystems. And so comparison isn't, I don't know, I'm not sure how relevant it is to say this is a percent change from 1930 or whatever compared to today. I don't know. Just thinking out loud.
There we get into issues of thematic resolution of what you call a grassland, and what species compose a grassland, and how you're going to define it. Here is as good as we can get with the historical data that we're working with. If you want to model historical data based on other types of data, then of course the comparison will be more in the lines of thought that you're thinking about.
Yeah.
Actually, just following up on that comment about the baseline, have you guys thought about incorporating any archaeological records? Because, it's quite extensive for the Bay Area, though they wouldn't be necessarily, it'd be more site-specific. From there, you could potentially model even further back than the historic, it'd be prehistoric periods, in a really crucial sort of, period of human intervention, like the fire.
So, I just wanted to show you. So there is one map for the Bay Area that
You're gonna choose start show at the slide, which it doesn't seem to be
Sean.
Go down to that lower right.
Yeah, but that little thing pops up.
What?
This thing pops up.
You can't go down to the lower right right there and. Oh, yeah.
So, David Mayfield at San Francisco State University actually went through the Spanish explorers' records, and so he used information from the Spanish records to actually reconstruct the land cover in this part of the Bay Area itself. And we're now in the process of trying to georeference it to the 1940s land cover and try to do the same process. if you want to see how, so these are the types of information that he collected to actually reconstruct the pre-Spanish land cover type.
Yeah.
Sort of related to that last map, it looked like from one of your graphs that salt marsh, coastal salt marsh is doing quite badly. Like it looked like that was one of the ones that is disappearing the most, which is what you would expect from what had happened like in the 1850s and everything. And is there a movement to try to, I don't know, replace some of that, or what's sort of going on, restore or?
As far as I've seen, not yet. And so there are some. So now we're trying to assess these changes that we're able to map and see what's going on in terms of restoration and whether they are leading to some action on the ground or not.
So I had a question about that also. So, I mean, is 20% of salt marsh protected right now? At 20% of the historical amount of salt marsh or the current?
The current.
So that, I mean, to me, that's a really important question is it 20% of current or of historical?
Yeah.
So I
Because if it's only 20% of current, that's a really different thing. And that leads me to the question of, what is it about, what's the reification of this 20% value? Where does that come from? Like, why is there, you said something, at some point you made a statement of, it's considered that if you have 20% of something protected, then that's a target number. And I guess I'm asking, where did that target come from, and what's the justification for it, and why does that target number have the current value as the denominator rather than the historical value?
So the targets, they basically are in a lot of the conservation biology literature. At least you have to have 12 to 15 of each land cover type.
But why?
It was a number that was used for policy. A lot of conservation biologists have said, let's get as much as we can. But then the politicians or the policymakers say, well, let's come up to a compromise. What is the minimum or a feasible amount that can be? I would say let's go for more. The Bay Area Open Space Council is actually trying to argue for 50% of the Bay Area in some sort of protection. So this is a target that is not a fixed criteria, it's just what is published most commonly in the literature.
And it doesn't have any scientific basis, it's really just kind of an arbitrary decision.
Yes. It's
Okay.
the minimum compromise that you can get between policymakers and conservation biologists that are always saying, let's get more and more and more. And policymakers, no, we can't give you that. So it's kind of
And so it's that sort of empirical political compromise that's led to that denominator being the current value. So in terms of the historical extent of salt marshes, for example, what % of the historical extent of salt marshes is preserved? Do you have those data? Or and of any of these
I don't know if I have that number here. I had a table that calculated those extents. I don't have it here. That calculated those extents based on the historical map and based on the current map to see if the percentages change, to see which ones did we do better over time, which ones did we actually lose land.
Can I ask one more question? Which is the land area has shifted also. I mean, there's more land now than there was historically because the bay has gotten smaller. So how did you deal with that?
We're just using a fixed extent that is based on historical.
So you're not even considering what's happening in the landfill areas?
We're just calculating the change from, so we're doing this at a 100-meter cell size, so we're just calculating at each 100-meter cell size what used to be there given a majority filter to what is it now giving a majority filter.
So that could also be affecting the salt marsh extent because the salt marshes have moved
Yes.
to the bay shore.
I'll just follow up. I'm kind of confused by using the current as the baseline because it kind of seems like then if you further degrade the non-protected areas, then you suddenly have more than 20% coverage. So then it seems like you could end up with this.
Yeah.
Well, that's more like a philosophical debate because you use the current one to project for the future what do you want. And so using the historical map, it's a nice academic exercise, but in terms of linking these results to decision making, the current one is more what we are likely to use.
Right, but that just, it sort of shows that this 20% is really, it's a moving baseline, and as you pointed out, and it shows that it has no scientific basis whatsoever, and it can't possibly have a scientific basis, because it doesn't relate to population sizes or anything.
That's valid.
Okay, I think let's stop it there. Thank you very much.